Great, thanks for the introduction. Thank you also for inviting me to Sao Paulo, which I love. And I think it's a really interesting place for the parallels with South Africa on the basis of issues that we have, and we can get some really nice solutions from you. My paper is about discourses of race and gender in the appointment of women judges in South Africa. And Laura and I seem to be giving the same paper, which makes me think that great minds think alike. So what I want to do, is look specifically at the role of the Judicial Services Commission and the appointment of women judges in South Africa. In post-apartheid, I don't know how much background to give you, so I might give you too much, but in post-apartheid South Africa, the judiciary was one of the areas in which we didn't have a sudden transition. So we didn't suddenly replace all the white judges with black judges or all the men with women, but instead two things happened. Firstly, we had a new mechanism to select judges, and that was done by the Judicial Services Commission, which I will refer to as the JSC. And the second aspect was that constitutionally, the JSC has a mandate to transform the judiciary to more accurately reflect the demographic composition in South Africa. So the Judicial Services Commission then is the body which selects judges. They have interviews in public. Anybody is able to attend their interviews, but their deliberations, their thinking about who to appoint is not public. And the JSC interviews has become a form of public spectacle, really. It's very well attended, and the press is always there, and it leads to all kinds of controversies. The Judicial Services Commission is then headed by the Chief Justice. In apartheid South Africa, virtually all judges were white men. It's clear that I think there was one woman, and there may have been one Indian man. For the rest, every single apartheid judge was a white man. In the 20 years of democracy, we've fared relatively well in transforming the racial basis of the judiciary. So since apartheid, we've succeeded to get the white people down to 32% of all judges, and 64% of judges are now not white. I will look at this in a little bit more detail later on, because it's not that simple. However, when we look at gender, the opposite has happened. Despite the fact that we have more than 50% of people in South Africa are women, only 32% of judges so far have been appointed have been women. However, as Laura indicated, you can't just speak of white or black, you have to disaggregate these things. And so I have figures here showing in more detail the statistics of which black people are appointed and where do these women sit. For those of you who don't know, in South Africa, the classification of people, the racial classification of people were basically in 4 groups. So we spoke of people of Indian descent, white people, African people, and then so-called colored people. So those are the historical bases for disadvantage, and so we continue to analyze on these bases. So what I have here are figures disaggregated for the different population groups and then by gender. Starting off with Indian men, Indian women, white men and white women. In total, there are 241, or there were at the time of counting, 241 judges in the high courts in South Africa. Of them, 12 were Indian men and 12 were Indian women, as you can see from the statistics. So Indian men comprised 5% of the total of all judges, and Indian women also 5% of the total. And Indian women are clearly half of all Indian judges are women. 10% of all South African judges are therefore Indian. The statistics for white people are interesting because we see that 64 of all of the 241 South African judges are still white men, which is 26.5% of all judges. White women are less than white men, and they only comprise 26% of all white judges are women. So white women are about a quarter of all white judges. The total figure of white judges, however, is 36% of all judges remain white, which is a vast overrepresentation of white judges reflected here. And where do they come from? We see that the category of judges which are really underrepresented are the African judges. Only 44% of all South African judges are African judges, and only 14.5% are African women judges. So that's a vast underrepresentation. And you see then also the figures for color judges. So the racial group that is underrepresented is African judges, but within all racial categories except for Indian judges, women comprise less than 50% of all the judges. As Laura indicated, the underrepresentation of women judges is most acute in the highest of courts. The Constitutional Court is the example which we get really het up about because we still only have 2 women judges, as we did in the beginning. But the women's representation in the Supreme Court of Appeal is also not what it should be. Now, in the past 4 or 5 years, there has been a shift in the discourses and in the arguments about the appointment of judges, because up to now, really, the greatest focus has been on the racial transformation of the South African judiciary. We can understand that if we see that virtually all the judges were white men. And we can also understand that when we realize that in apartheid South Africa, white male judges really were complicit in, or not all of them, but most of them, were complicit in and failed to challenge the racially discriminatory laws in South Africa. So the push has really been to focus on the appointment of judges of color at the expense of focusing on the gender of judges. However, in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen a radical shift, especially in the media, around the appointment of judges, where there's been a lot of media pressure on the JSC to start appointing women. One of these factors has been the involvement of a particular academic unit, NGO. It's called the Democratic Governance and Rights Unit at UCT. I'll call it the DGRU. They have been particularly active in pushing for the appointment of women judges. They have had a very strong presence in the media, and they have regularly engaged with the media, indicating that the appointment of women judges is an issue. What's quite interesting is that the DGRU has, every time that there's a panel selecting judges, they have compiled reports on the candidates, so that they look if the candidate has been an acting judge or a judge who's asking for promotion. They have compiled a summary report of all the judgments delivered by this particular judge, and then highlighting where there are problematic judgments. In doing this, they have also looked at the candidate's record on cases dealing with sexual assault or gender cases in general, but that hasn't been their exclusive focus. What's more interesting are 2 kinds of formal interventions by the DGRU, which are quite startling. On the one hand, the DGRU has gone to the extent of reporting the Judicial Services Commission to the Gender Commission for failing to appoint sufficient women judges. The Gender Commission is one of our Chapter 9 institutions which are supposed to see to it that our democracy functions properly, and the DGRU has reported the JSC to the Gender Commission and asked the Gender Commission to investigate the JSC. Nothing has come from that at all. It's been sitting there now for 3 years and nothing has happened. So this has clearly not worked at all. Another area in which, or another intervention which they've done, is they have joined as amicus curiae one of the court cases which has been brought against the JSC by another NGO. So they've done some kind of formal interventions, but most of their interventions have been through the media. So how does the JSC respond? Well, really, the responses by the JSC to the media uproar about their failure to appoint women is really a kind of contradictory and sporadic. There seems to be a kind of a cycle whereby the JSC, once there is criticism, acknowledges that there is a problem, and then go ahead to appoint great blocks of women. So in one session they appointed 5 women, and another session they'd appoint 3 women, only to then afterwards return to the pattern whereby they appoint more men, as if they have now done what they should have done in terms of gender, and we can go back to business as usual. What is also quite clear is that there have been some high-profile cases, especially relating to the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal, where the JSC have not appointed women who were eminently qualified and arguably even more qualified than the men who were up for the post. The one is an issue around the judge president of the Free State, and then the other was, which got the NGOs really hit up, was the failure to appoint Judge Meyer, a woman, to the Constitutional Court. So, on the one hand, they sometimes appoint blocks of women to the lower courts, and sometimes they fail to appoint really suitable female candidates. Their comments are also contradictory. On the one hand, you hear the JSC calling all the time, saying, please, please, can more women apply for the positions? And on the other hand, we hear from them from time to time things like, women candidates are not suitable, they are not suitably qualified, we want better women candidates. And we've heard on occasion even, or it was reported in the media on occasion even, that where in a case where the woman candidate was really well qualified, that we don't have to appoint the best candidate, which is really quite startling when the best candidate is a woman. There have also been some really interesting occasions in which dealing with gender at a different level. On the one hand, the JSC have consistently acknowledged that there are structural problems within the legal profession which make it difficult for women to reach the higher end of the profession, and so they've really highlighted things like briefing patterns and so forth. Acknowledging these structural factors. There was an interesting incident in which a magistrate who applied to become a judge had been, one of the NGOs had reported to the JSC that he had failed for many years to pay his child maintenance, his alimony. And the JSC took him on publicly on this. He was not only not appointed, but he was subsequently removed from his position as an acting judge. We don't know whether that was the JSC's doing, but I imagine that. So on the one hand, they came down on this man quite heavily for failing to pay his child maintenance. On the other hand, another recently reported issue related to a female judge who wanted a transfer to another division because her husband had been arrested, her children were without childcare, and she wanted to move closer to her children. And the JSC, for whatever reasons, refused and were publicly very unsympathetic. One of the JSC members, a female in fact, said when the applicant or when the judge was crying when she described her circumstances, the JSC commission member said, "We have no sympathy with you. You can cry, but that's not going to make us feel sorry for you." So we have these contradictory responses by the JSC. 5 minutes. Let me get to the point immediately. What strikes me, however, when we look at both the JSC and the NGOs pushing for the appointment of women judges, however, is that there is no public focus on the appointment of feminist judges. There is this essentialist idea that women judges per se, the appointment of women judges per se would be sufficient. So the focus seems to be on numbers of women rather than who the particular women are. The JSC will sometimes ask about gender in their interviews, and they ask strange things. They ask male candidates, should we appoint you or should we rather appoint a woman who is less qualified than you, which seems to be a stock question. And of the women candidates, there have been several times when they said to a woman candidate, so what have you done to transform the gender composition of the profession, which is really ludicrous. The NGOs seem to have pushed also similarly, mostly for the appointment of women candidates rather than feminist candidates. It may be a strategic move because of the danger of using the word feminism. So what happens is that feminist candidates are not appointed, rather women candidates are appointed. And if you look at the media, I'm not going to go into this, but the big media spats in the past 4 years, really the focus has remained on race. So the things which people got really het up about relate to the failure of the JSC to appoint particular white male judges. And both the commentators, the journalists, and the members of the JSC have become extremely heated and about this. And the Chief Justice has unfortunately placed the calls for gender or the appointment of women within this context of the push for racial diversity, of the racial spat in the Constitutional Court. He seems from time to time, not always, but he seems sometimes to suggest that those who agitate for the appointment of more women really are doing this in order to stop racial transformation of the bench. So he puts the arguments for gender really in the context of race. My point is that the lack of focus on gender and feminism really means that we are returning to an unfortunate situation of a formal equality, whereby the focus is on numbers of women. There is an essentialist belief that any woman and all women would be pushing the agenda of women, whilst men, of course, are seen as not being able to do that, and we know that that's essentialist and incorrect. We see no challenge by the JSC nor by the NGOs to look really at people's commitment to gender equality, whether they be males or females. And the result, I argue, is that we sit with a situation where women judges are in danger of becoming tokens for transformation. And the picture, I don't know how many people in Brazil have been following the Oscar Pistorius trial, but the picture is of Judge Thokozile Masipa, who was the judge in the Oscar trial. And it was interesting to watch the media reaction to the appointment of this judge to be really the picture of the South African judiciary in the Oscar trial, which we knew everybody would be watching. Because when she was just appointed, there was a huge public applause. And during the trial, there seemed to have been a great amount of compliments to her for her judicial demeanor and for looking like a good judge. However, when the judgment came out, and it was not what many people had wanted, not everybody, but there was a strong flavor in the media comment which vilified her in a particularly racial way. Some of the comments were to the effect of, "Oh, look, this is what you get when you appoint incompetent women or incompetent people to the bench. She doesn't know the law," which carried kind of racial messages and gendered messages that she's incompetent because she is a black woman. So yes, I would agree with Laura that we need to take into that women can make certain contributions as being women. However, Rosemary Hunter has said that we shouldn't just focus on the appointment of women judges. We should really focus on the appointment of feminist judges. Rosemary Hunter thinks that men can't be feminist judges, but I disagree with her. I think men can be feminists. Yeah, and that's what I want to say. Thank you.